Welcome to the Life After Sugar podcast, the podcast that's not just about sugar, but about your relationship with it and also with food and especially with yourself. So if you want to discover your life after sugar and hear inspiring stories from all kinds of people who also cut out sugar in their way, at their pace, for their own reasons, this is the podcast for you. Because when you take away the sugar, you can finally discover the real sweetness in your life. I'm your host, Netta Gorman, and today I want to talk about a subject that's quite controversial, even though it's surprising that it should be controversial, because those of us who have been, addicted to sugar, either in the past or still today, for us, there is no discussion, there is no issue, there is no controversy. For us, sugar feels addictive. And this is what I want to talk about today, but just before I do, I want to invite you over to my website, aftersugarclub.com. This is where you'll find lots of free resources about reducing sugar and why it might be a good idea for you, and also about fermented foods and gut health, and why looking after your gut health is central to your general health. You'll also find all the podcast episodes on aftersugarclub.com/podcast, and that's where you'll also find my 5 tips to help you with cravings that you can download. And on my website, you can also download my simple guide to getting more energy with less sugar. And you can also find me on Facebook, on my Facebook page, Life After Sugar, on Instagram at My Life After Sugar. That's where I put photos of my meals and other Instagram stuff. And I'm also on Clubhouse. Look for me with my name, Netta Gorman. So let's get back to the subject of, is sugar addictive? And, I like to read different sources, different books, different articles to get different points of view about this, including our own points of view and our own personal N=1 experiences of feeling like we're addicted to sugar. And actually, biologically and neurologically, sugar and flour affect the brain in specific ways. And it's not necessarily the sugar cane or the sugar beet or the grains that sugar and flour come from. It's what's been done to them that makes them affect the brain this way. And I'm not saying everyone's brains react the exact same way. We're all different, and some people seem to have no problem with sugar or flour. Lucky them. But generally speaking, in the same way that cocaine comes from the coca leaf of South America, and if you chewed on the coca leaf, it might make your cheeks a little bit numb or give you a tiny little lift, like, say, drinking a cup of caffeinated coffee. It's pretty rare to find anyone that would commit a crime or steal money to get more coca leaves, right? It's the same with sugar and grains. It's not the original plant that's the problem. It's when you take the inner essence of either the coca leaf or a grain or sugar cane or a sugar beet and refine and purify that inner essence into a fine powder, just like cocaine, that's when you have a very powerful drug. And surprising as it may seem, or maybe not, a review published by the British Journal of Sports Medicine has claimed that refined sugar has a similar effect on the brain as illegal drugs such as cocaine. And in studies on rats, it's been found that there are significant similarities between eating sugar and drug-like effects such as binging, craving, tolerance, withdrawal, dependence, and reward. The research scientists claim that sugar alters mood and can induce reward and pleasure in the same way drugs such as cocaine affect the brain. And they cite studies in rats where sugar was preferred to cocaine and studies in mice where the mice experienced sugar withdrawal symptoms. Can we really extrapolate that how rats and mice react to sugar affects humans as well? Well, in this particular review, it looked at all the existing research about sugar and its potential addictive qualities. And the lead author of the review at St. Luke's Mid-America Heart Institute said that unlike salt, there is no aversion signal to sugar. In other words, unlike salt, there isn't like an aversion signal to sugar, like a built-in safety mechanism that protects us from eating too much sugar. So people can eat a lot of sugar and still want more, whereas once people have eaten enough salt, they usually don't want any more. The review also looked at withdrawal symptoms, and the authors of the review claimed that when people give up sugar completely, what they suffer from is withdrawal symptoms that come from a dopamine deficiency in the brain. And they say that dopamine deficiency can be temporarily relieved by eating more sugar. So sugar, they say, can override our self-control mechanisms, hence the term sugar fix. And if you're anything like me, you've actually experienced this. In his book Good Sugar, Bad Sugar, author Alan Carr talks about the addictive personality. And what he says is that the theory of the addictive personality stems from looking at the situation from the wrong perspective. He says any character traits shared by addicts are not the cause of their addiction, they are the result. As someone who's experienced struggles with their eating, like me, you'll probably recognize this feeling of not being able to understand why you can apply your will or your willpower to other aspects of your life, but when it comes to eating, and especially to eating sugary and starchy foods, you feel weak and helpless and guilty. It's like you're caught in a trap, but the thing to understand is that it has nothing to do with willpower. And although it's natural to assume that the problem lies with you, the truth is that it isn't your fault. In the book Good Sugar, Bad Sugar by Alan Carr, he says that it's tragic to believe that you're born with a genetic predisposition to self-destruction. But in fact, he says, you're not. The addictive personality theory is just that, a theory, nothing more. And the question he asks in his book is, so why do some people fall deeper into the trap than others? Why can one person have the occasional chocolate while another eats the whole box at once, like I used to do? Doesn't that suggest that one has a personality that's more prone to addiction than the other? The answers can be pretty complex, but in the book Good Sugar, Bad Sugar, Alan Carr says that for some people, the void is greater than for others because of their upbringing, their environment in which they live, and a whole host of other factors. And these can influence how much and how often we eat, as well as what we eat. And what the author considers to be bad sugar, in other words, processed foods with refined sugar and flour, well, he says that eating those types of sugars never really makes you feel satisfied. He calls this the big monster, and he says that the big monster tells you that bad sugar is the only thing that can fill the void. But the irony is that this bad sugar creates a void that is a triple blow, a physical low, a psychological craving, and the misery of feeling like an addict. And he says that sugar addiction has nothing to do with your personality and everything to do with the brainwashing you've been subjected to from birth and from the food industry. Whether you agree or not is up to you. But I think it's an interesting theory to start thinking about. And despite lots of scientific studies and, of course, our personal experiences, there are opponents of the argument around sugar and addiction with some other experts disputing the claim that sugar is addictive. For example, an article in the journal Clinical Nutrition in 2010 claimed that there is no support from studies on humans that sugar is physically addictive and that addiction to sugar plays a role in eating disorders. And another study of research on the effect of sugar on rats argued that the addiction-like behaviors that are seen are only if the animals are restricted to having sugar 2 hours every day, whereas if they're allowed to have it whenever they want it, these behaviors aren't seen. What does that mean? Well, in those types of studies, what they did is that they withheld food or sugar from the rats before giving it to them, which made them act addicted to them. Once they had the sugar or the food, it lit up their dopamine centers, but the argument is that just because food or sugar lights up the brain centers with dopamine, that doesn't make it an addiction. The argument is that we're wired to be fixated on food or sugar when we feel restricted. It does make sense, and in scientific studies, findings from the animal literature suggest that addiction-like behaviors such as binging occur only in the context of intermittent access to sugar. So I'm wondering whether these types of behaviors are more to do with the access to sweet-tasting or highly palatable foods and not necessarily all foods. In fact, those types of products I would hesitate to call food. So is it the neurochemical effect of sugar on the brain per se? Or is it that the food industry has done such a great job of creating products that hook our brains? I'll talk a little bit more about this later. Whether or not food addiction has been scientifically proven doesn't really seem to be that important when you're in the throes of that type of addictive behavior because it feels very real. And the back and forth between experts about whether or not food or sugar is actually addictive seems to me to be putting the energy in the wrong place. Maybe it doesn't actually matter whether sugar is clinically addictive. Maybe we might be better off using all that knowledge for actually helping people who feel addicted. Another argument against whether food is actually addictive or not is that it's not the food or the sugar that's the problem, it's the restriction that leads to addictive behavior. Now, that might be true. Certainly people who have been through the Life After Sugar program report not feeling restricted at all. Whereas in diets, yes, I can see how you'd feel restricted. But for those of us who feel like we're addicted to using food as a coping mechanism with no thought as to restriction, again, it really doesn't seem helpful for experts to deny our experience and tell us that food or sugar isn't addictive. I mean, binge eating disorder is absolutely recognized by experts, and it's one of the most common eating disorders. And I don't think really that any nutrition experts are denying the existence of eating as a coping mechanism in response to emotions or trauma. But the argument is still out there that you still can't treat food like an addictive substance because, well, we all have to eat. It's a bit like saying that you've got to have water or air every day, and therefore it's addictive. Sounds like a bit of twisted logic to me, but anyway. Yes, there exists such a thing as the Yale Food Addiction Scale, but many of the things that are on there that talk about addictive behaviors are actually also symptoms of chronic dieting. In other words, restriction and feeling restricted. Also, we have to remember that a lot of studies about nutrition have super flawed methodology because we can't easily control human behavior, especially in relation to what they eat, when they eat, how often they eat, and what they remember eating. Whereas with rats and mice, we can actually starve them and then do all sorts of experiments and tests with different types of food and behavior. I know that in my life after sugar, I feel free now from all of those addictive-like behaviors. Is it because I don't eat sugar and flour anymore? Or is it because I don't feel restricted or controlled anymore? Or maybe it's a bit of both. I mean, I can say with 100% confidence that my relationship with food is healed now that I don't eat those types of hyper-palatable foods anymore. I get what they're saying about the feeling of restriction leading to addictive behaviors, making us wonder whether it's really the food or the context of the food. But certainly once I stopped eating sugar and flour, and basically processed products that are made from them, that type of craving and behaviors stopped. So, opponents of the theory that sugar is addictive argue that there is a reward system in the brain that controls eating behavior, but unlike sugar, illegal drugs such as cocaine hijack those systems and turn the normal controls off. They also argue that rats choosing sugar over cocaine in some experiments is not surprising, as animals will always choose the substance that will give them energy. What do you think about that? Is there such a big difference between the behavior of rats and the behavior of humans, where the addictive quality of sugar is concerned? We've got to wonder. And you know that I'm interested in the meanings of words, right? So I looked up the word addictive in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and basically addictive is just causing or characterized by addiction. And in the dictionary, the noun addiction is defined as a compulsive, chronic, physiological or psychological need for a habit-forming substance, behavior, or activity having harmful physical, psychological, or social effects and typically causing well-defined symptoms such as anxiety, irritability, tremors, or nausea upon withdrawal or abstinence. Have you ever experienced any of those with sugar? And if I look in a medical dictionary, the definition of addiction is a persistent, compulsive dependence on a behavior or substance. The term has been partially replaced by the word dependence for substance abuse. Addiction has been extended, however, to include mood-altering behaviors or activities. Some researchers speak of two types of addictions: substance addictions, for example, alcoholism, drug abuse, and smoking, and process addictions, for example, gambling, spending, shopping, eating, and sexual activity. And in Michael Moss's 2021 book, Hooked, he says, speed kills, or rather, speed addicts. He says, the psychologists and physiologists who work on addiction have been documenting this for decades now. The ability of a substance to excite the brain and set in motion the behavior that leads us to act compulsively is in large part a matter of how fast the substance reaches the brain. Faster leads to a stronger grip. And this is what I was saying before about flour and sugar. It's not the grains, it's not the whole grains, it's not the sugar cane or the sugar beet. It's the fact that they've been refined and turned into powder form, and that powder form hits the brain so much faster. And Michael Moss in his book quotes research at Brookhaven by Nora Volkow, who was one of the first to observe that the faster something reaches the brain, the greater the brain's response. Now, science is still sorting out the precise reason for this reaction, but one school of thought is that speed compels the brain to boost the intensity of the subsequent reward that we get, which would encourage us to have more of that substance. Another theory, advanced by a team from the University of Michigan's psychiatry department in 2004, is that speed changes the brain's neurology in ways that might undermine our ability to stop and think before acting on a compulsion to use an addictive substance. You know, when you just can't help yourself from eating chocolate or cookies or chips or whatever. You know what I mean? But here's the thing about speed and disordered eating, Michael Moss says in his book. Of all the substances that can get us hooked, nothing is faster than food when it comes to stirring up the brain. Certain types of foods, that is. And he says that the phenomenal success of processed food is owed in large part to the speed that marks its every aspect. The entire industry is built on speed, starting with the manufacturing plants. They want to get their products out there as fast as possible and sell them as fast as possible. And most critically of all, the book says, there is speed in processed foods once they get into our hands. They unseal quickly, they heat up in the microwave quickly, and most important, they excite the brain quickly when they reach the mouth. Michael Moss gives an example of an ice cream cone. He says when you lick an ice cream cone, taste buds have a mechanism that detects the sugar in the ice cream, and this sensing of the sugar gets converted into an electrical signal that then races to the brain with the full force of the actual sugar, but much faster. The signal alerts and excites the brain to be ready and eager to eat. 600 milliseconds from the first lick of the ice cream to the very strong impulse to lick more. And he says that the gut helps out in this process too. We take hours to digest the things that we consume, but the instant the stomach receives a glob of sugary food, it also sends alerts to the brain. And scientists have only recently uncovered this, and they have yet to identify the precise nature of these signals, so we don't have a lot of scientific studies to show this. But their best guess is that the stomach generates a hormone or basket of hormones in order to help stimulate our appetite. And there is another way that processed food, especially sugary food, appears to be sending fast signals to the brain. It gets into our bloodstream really fast, and this happens through digestion when we convert food into the sugar known as glucose. And then it gets into our blood system to nourish our body. But glucose can start arriving in the blood within 10 minutes of eating something, which is as fast, Michael Moss says, as snorted cocaine. In fact, with all these ultra-convenience, processed, hyper-palatable foods, you can go from I'm hungry to having like a whole meal in a bite. In other words, you can go from impulse to action without even thinking about it, he says. And this speed and this loss of impulse control with these hyper-palatable, processed food products, and especially those that contain sugar and flour, make us lose control and fall into the mode of acting compulsively, where we're not even thinking anymore. Our desire, our wanting takes over, and our decision on what to eat and how much gets driven by something other than our free will. We're choosing, and yet we're not, says Michael Moss. And if you've ever had the experience of feeling like you have no control or you have no free will, you just can't say no to a certain type of food, especially sugary foods, then you know what he's talking about. I certainly remember this very clearly. And Dr. Robert Lustig of the University of California in San Francisco, who's one of the leading experts on the effect of sugar, he describes how it takes only 3 weeks of consistent overstimulation for the dopamine receptors in our brain to thin out. And once that happens, addiction takes hold, he says. That means first that life in between eating the stimulating foods feels bleak, which is one of the links between the standard American diet and depression. Second, he says, the ability to actually taste food diminishes. In addition, studies have shown that the anticipation of food in the brain of an obese person is much stronger than in a slender person, but when they eat, the pleasure is lower. In other words, it's like the payoff isn't even worth it. You're just craving the next hit. So if you've ever driven to the all-night supermarket or corner store to scavenge the aisles for cookies or a pint of ice cream or a bag of chips or a bottle of soda, and then rush home to eat it compulsively for hours and then feel guilty about it, then this is part of what these hyper-palatable, sugary and starchy foods do to your brain. But funnily enough, for me at least, once I stopped eating sugar, sweeteners and flour completely, all these types of behaviors and impulse control problems completely disappeared. All those overpowering cravings completely disappeared as well. That insatiable hunger also went away. What was going on? Why? What's going on in the brain when we are eating sugar and flour compared to when we aren't? Well, the insatiable hunger is very often caused by leptin resistance, and this is what drives people to mindlessly put food in their mouth all day, says Susan Peirce-Thompson, PhD, of Bright Line Eating. This type of grazing, or another type of behavior which is like the overpowering cravings that we have, or even a binging mechanism, is like wanting to scratch that itch in the brain. But where does that itch originate? Well, it happens in an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which is actually a cluster of neurons activated by dopamine and designed to motivate our behavior with rewards, which is why so many life-sustaining activities stimulate the brain to release dopamine, like sex and physical exertion and, yes, eating. But this area of the brain is also the seat of addiction, Susan Peirce-Thompson says. Our brains simply weren't designed to process the modern chemical flood we can get from all these processed, sugary, starchy foods we eat. When you start pumping that much dopamine into the nucleus accumbens, it protects itself from the overstimulation by a process called down-regulating. And down-regulation is an adaptive process. When the brain is hit with an onslaught of stimuli, like from a donut, say, the brain thins out the dopamine receptors in an effort to adapt to the overload, so that the next time a sensory tsunami comes, the response will be more manageable. The problem is that now you're changing the physiology of the brain. If the stimulation is not forthcoming, you don't feel very good. It's pretty much the same whether you're a cocaine addict, a crystal meth addict, or a sugar addict. And in fact, food and sugar are far harder to cope with because they're so easily available, cheap, and even socially accepted and encouraged. And just like drugs, these types of hyperpalatable, sugary and starchy foods can virtually wipe out the dopamine receptors in the nucleus accumbens, which means that after a certain point, getting high doesn't even feel pleasurable or good anymore. All you feel is like you need more. And once the dopamine down-regulation kicks in, what you're forced to tolerate between fixes is this extreme feeling of the absence of pleasure. And then you need more. Not to get high, but just to feel normal. And this is what a lot of people misunderstand about addiction. Whether it's from drugs or sugar, people think that the addict is using the substance to feel good, but actually the addict is just using it to feel okay for a bit, or not so bad. And sugar didn't even enter our diets until the 1700s. So biologically, our bodies and brains never really adapted to process it well. And for a long time, it was okay because, well, for hundreds of years, sugar was expensive and only available to people of nobility who could afford it. But then, with the sugar plantations, all that changed. And as we all know, over the last few decades of global trade, all those federal subsidies and progressively more ingenious snack food manufacturing, sugar consumption has increased dramatically. And that means that we're hitting our brains with ever higher, ever more potent levels of stimulation. We're flooding the receptors with dopamine. From a neurological perspective, the research is very clear, says Susan Peirce Thompson, who has a PhD in brain and cognitive sciences. She says we need to stop looking at the culprits as food and start thinking of them as what they really are, drugs. But according to the American Psychiatric Association, substance use disorder, or SUD, is another term for what's sometimes called addiction. They say that people with a substance use disorder may have distorted thinking and behaviors. They say that changes in the brain's structure and function are what cause people to have intense cravings, changes in personality, abnormal movements, and other behaviors. And they say that brain imaging studies show changes in the areas of the brain that relate to judgment, decision-making, learning, memory, and behavioral control. Are they talking about sugar? No, they're not. In fact, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th edition, or DSM-5, which is the American Psychiatric Association's gold standard text on mental health, and which was crafted by hundreds of mental health experts, well, the DSM-5 has 11 criteria or symptoms for substance use disorders based on decades of research. And none of those substances include sugar. And in fact, the DSM-5 establishes 9 types of substance-related disorders: alcohol, caffeine, cannabis, like marijuana, hallucinogens, inhalants, opioids, like heroin, sedatives, hypnotics, or anxiolytics, like Valium, stimulants like cocaine, and tobacco. None of these are sugar. And yet, if you're anything like me, you might agree that sugar really should be in that list, maybe more than caffeine. And even if the DSM-5 made a big deal of acknowledging binge eating disorder, there are still many who have been advocating that food addiction get accepted in the DSM-5R or the DSM-6. So let's hope that that initiative gets translated into real recognition of the power of sugar and food on so many of us. Now, I'm no expert in neurology or even addiction, and I don't want to get all semantic and pedantic about the official definition of addiction or an addictive substance. But what I can tell you from my personal experience is that when I was still consuming sugar and flour and food products that contained them, my behavior was completely different from what it is now. And I'm guessing that you may be experiencing behavior that's similar to what I described here in this podcast episode. But the good news is that it is possible to break the habit of eating products with sugar and flour, and in that way to change our addictive behavior into more healthy behaviors. And for me, it wasn't so much the food that I'm eating now which is healthier for me, it's my behavior and especially my relationship with my food and with myself that's more healthy. And this is what I teach in the Life After Sugar program that helps you to completely transform your relationship with sugary and starchy foods, as well as with yourself and with your needs for these types of foods. And there's no judgment or taboos here. I mean, we can discuss the semantics of the word addiction and addictive until the cows come home. But this goes way beyond the meaning of the words. This is about your life and your relationship with your food. And I'm guessing your desire to get off this merry-go-round of compulsive behavior and guilt and cravings and that feeling of loss of control. So rather than arguing back and forth about whether sugar and flour are really addictive substances according to this scientific study or that scientific study, I really think it would actually be more useful if we got down to the real issue, which is helping you change your relationship with these types of foods. And that is 100% possible with Life After Sugar. And you can find more information about the Life After Sugar program on my website, aftersugarclub.com. And if you enjoyed this episode and found it useful for you, then scroll down and leave me a review. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you. And you can also subscribe to this podcast so that you'll never miss another episode. That's it for this week. Keep in touch and see you soon for another episode.